Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I really appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to all your questions, comments, critiques. So the title of the talk is The Case for and Against a Carbon Tax. That title is very deliberate to make clear that I am not unambiguously coming down on either side. And I should also note that this is joint work with someone named Pedro Suarez, who's a master's student in economics in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So the motivation is that a huge amount of discussion of climate change seems to assume that policy should do everything it possibly can. Every kind of regulation, mandate, subsidy, rule, etc., in every aspect of policy making, federal level, state level, local level, etc. Okay? Relatedly, the existing discussion, the large fraction of the existing discussion, thinks of climate change as an existential threat. If you know who Greta Thunberg is, she's this teenager who has made a huge career already out of complaining that the current generations are going to be ruining the planet for future generations. You see much stuff that has that same flavor. And of course, if you think that there's an existential threat, it would tend to imply that one should act immediately to try to deal with that threat. It would tend to imply one should reduce emissions drastically or entirely or something like that. It implies a very substantial, huge amount of response if you really are facing an existential threat. Recent UN report came out about 2 weeks ago. You might well have heard some news coverage of that. Okay, is a perfect example along with the Greta Thunberg type of comments. Okay. What I'm going to explain is that economics offers a different answer. I'm going to make three main points. One is that most existing policies that we use to address climate change are problematic in various ways, okay, to varying degrees. I'm not saying they're all equally bad or that they're all necessarily awful, but they have a tendency to have serious problems that make them ineffective. That in principle, a properly designed carbon tax would almost certainly be better, or certainly most economists would agree that a well-designed carbon tax would be far better than the current hodgepodge command and control set of policies. At the same time, however, many of the things which hinder designing all these individual interventions, such as subsidizing research or having fuel economy standards and the like, many of those would hinder designing an ideal carbon tax, or implementing and enforcing an ideal carbon tax, and political economy issues will enter in and give us something substantially different than the ideal carbon tax. So things that might actually be worse, than doing nothing at all. Saying we should do nothing is going to sound, incredibly unconvincing, but it's certainly part of the standard economics-y perspective that says we always should be comparing the available alternatives. If your doctor says you have two choices, you're going to suffer from this condition one way or the other, but taking this medication is going to make you suffer less. Then you don't say, well, I'm going to ignore that, or do something else because it's not curing me. You say, I only have those choices and I have to take the one which is least bad. And one reason that I'll discuss why we should think that doing nothing might be the least bad is that in the economic setting, the damage from climate change, while plausibly real, is certainly finite, not infinite. And so it doesn't imply the very, very strong kinds of reactions that we hear from much of the discussion in the press. So I should say, just to sort of set the stage, that in the talk, I'm going to set aside whether the scientific consensus on climate change is accurate. Instead, I want to talk about how policymakers should respond if the current consensus is accurate. Say the consensus is represented by the reports of the international panels on climate change. I don't necessarily, as an aside, believe that it's all should be taken as God's truth. I think there's room for reasonable people to be cautious at a minimum, or maybe even disagree with many pieces of the current scientific consensus, but that's a huge activity and somewhat outside my realm of expertise. So I'm just going to talk about, if it's true, should we be doing the things that the climate activists think that we should be doing, or considering something different. And other aside, just for simplicity, I will talk about this as though it's a problem having to do with carbon emissions. Of course, there are other sources of emissions as well that are greenhouse gases and may be contributing to global warming, but just to keep it simple, I'll talk about carbon, okay? But the same issues would apply for all of that. So the outline, there'll be four main pieces to the talk. First, I will explain the standard economics framework for thinking about this kind of issue, which involves discussing what economists call externalities and what that implies for policy. I'll talk about the kinds of problems that will exist with all the existing policies and mainly give you some very concrete examples which illustrate the issues cleanly. Explain why an ideal carbon tax, and I'll define exactly what I mean by the ideal carbon tax as we go along. If you could adopt and stick to the ideal carbon tax, would 99.9% be vastly better than what we're currently doing, but then confess that in the real world, getting to that or sticking with that ideal carbon tax is going to be difficult, okay? All right, so here's the framework. Economics holds very broadly that voluntary transactions are efficient. They're efficient in the sense they tend to produce a bigger economic pie. There, of course, are some exceptions to that in economics about people who don't know their own preferences or people who are irrational, but I'm ignoring that for the moment. Okay? The idea behind why that's efficient, why that's good, is that if it's voluntary, it must be because buyer willingness to pay for a good or a service or to engage in any activity is higher than the seller willingness to sell, okay? And so each side is better off when those transactions occur. If they're voluntary, they must be better off. And that's why markets promote economic welfare, because they enable these voluntary transactions. Okay? This is standard economics 101, okay? Roughly speaking, with a few caveats, something that every economist, okay, would agree with. However, okay, there are cases where transactions, interactions broadly, affect third parties, okay? And therefore, laissez-faire, that is not non-intervention, not having any regulation or taxation or subsidies, just letting markets operate, might not be efficient. The obvious example is pollution, okay? If a factory is making cars, okay, but simultaneously putting noxious fumes into the air, and those fumes affect the lungs and the health of people who live near the factory, okay, then that's a problem, because in effect, those factories are producing a bad, the pollution, along with the good thing that they're producing, the car or the toaster oven or whatever it might be. And unfortunately, in many markets, okay, you don't need third-party consent to generate externalities. Factories can produce these noxious fumes or dump polluted things into the water. People can drive on the highway and make a lot of noise. Okay, so I can run my snowblower early in the morning to clear my driveway and wake up my neighbors and so on and so forth. So if third-party consent is not required and these third-party effects are not trivial, then markets might easily generate too much of the bad stuff relative to the good stuff, okay? And therefore there's potentially a role for intervention to try to achieve some balance, because the right measure of welfare should be the total amount of goods and services we produce minus the value that we would in principle pay to avoid of all the bad stuff that's simultaneously getting produced. Okay, a few comments to clarify the concept. The first one is that not all third-party effects are externalities. There's a term in economics calls them pecuniary externalities because they have to do with prices, with money. A simple example would be a change in preferences. Let's say a bunch of people woke up one morning and decided that, in contrast to their life to that point, they preferred chocolate ice cream to vanilla ice cream. So there's a huge increase in the demand for chocolate relative to vanilla. That's going to change the price of chocolate relative to vanilla, okay? But it's not what economists call an externality. Why not? Because there's been no change in the productive capacity of the economy. Okay? No one has been directly adversely affected in terms of what possibilities exist in the marketplace. And so that is not a case where economists would argue for any intervention. The tastes are what the tastes are, and the market production and prices will adjust to reflect those preferences. So you can think of other examples. If someone outbids me in an auction, okay, that's a negative effect on me. I don't get the good that I might have wanted, but it's not an externality because the amount of the good that's available to the auction hasn't changed. Someone gets it. There's only a distributional issue as to who actually ends up with the surplus of owning the good that's being auctioned off. A different comment is that it's easy to think of externalities that we might think of as small or trivial. Some people don't like being around sloppy dressers. Okay? They perceive the world as being less pleasant when that occurs. And so they might think about banning tie-dye t-shirts or imposing a tax on people who have messy jeans or raggedy jeans. But very few people would actually endorse trying to address those externalities with policy, simply because if you tried to do that, you would have to have an infinite number of policies to address every single possible thing that somebody happens to get some negative utility from. Okay? So we're setting aside trivial externalities for today. Okay? Third, there are some things which would fit the definition of an externality, but which mostly societies would say we don't accept, and we're not going to adopt policies to address those. Example might be preferences about race or gender or religion. There could be people who say, I'm less happy when I'm around people who are not of my race or whatever. Okay? They are experiencing something negative. They might be better off by promoting some type of segregation, apartheid, something like that. But most societies regard those as unacceptable preferences and therefore would not want to respond, okay, with any kind of policy intervention to implement those preferences. Although, of course, some societies have adopted policies along those lines. Okay, so those are some comments or caveats, okay, to help understand the concept. Finally, there's a key point, which is that markets sometimes fix externalities. An example would be a noisy neighbor. If I'm getting up at 5 a.m. and using my snowblower to clear my driveway, and my neighbors don't want to get up till 6 or 7, okay, I'm imposing a negative externality on them. Okay, if they care about it a lot, they should pay me. They should come knock on my door and say, look, we'll give you $5 every time it snows if you wait and don't snow blow your driveway until later in the day. Okay? And if they make an offer where it causes me to say, gee, I'd rather have the $5 than have my driveway cleared that early, then a bargain will take place. If they're not willing to pay me enough, then it's actually efficient for me to be able to do it because the benefit I'm getting from snow blowing early is greater than the disutility that they get from being woken up. Okay? So that's one kind of illustration where a market, right, private interactions between consumers or consumers and businesses might solve that externality problem. A different classic example in the famous paper by Ronald Coase, okay, that's why Coase is at the top of the slide, I should have said that, from 1937, had to do with the existence of lighthouses. Many people argued that lighthouses will be underprovided by the market because the lighthouse can't easily charge all the ships that benefit from the existence of the lighthouse that help light the way and alert ships to where there might be rocky shoals that they would run aground on and so on. Okay, and so no one could make a profit from operating a lighthouse, okay, because all the people would just go by in the ocean and not pay you anything. And that's why government needed to provide lighthouses. But Coase said, actually, the market found a solution. The people who run ports, okay, or marinas, okay, near where the lighthouses would be, okay, they have an incentive in creating a lighthouse because that helps people want to come to their port, and they could then charge the people to be able to dock at their port and recoup the cost of owning and operating the lighthouses. And indeed, Coase found substantial evidence from the United Kingdom that there was private ownership of lighthouses, provision of lighthouses, exactly the way his theory suggested. So there are historical examples. You can come up with simple hypothetical examples where markets sometimes will fix externalities. But you can also think of many cases where the transaction cost might prevent private solutions. One kind of transaction cost could be people just think it's wrong to bargain over something. My neighbors might think that even though they value the quiet more than I value snow blowing early, it's just wrong that they have to pay me to shut up my snowblower. And so maybe you don't get the private transaction. More generally, if there are lots of people involved and if the coordination that would have to take place to have the people who are adversely affected by the externality bribe the people who are causing the externality to stop doing it, then it might just get too complicated and so the transactions would never occur. Okay? And a key source of transaction cost in many applications is the absence of well-defined property rights. So imagine a small lake in the countryside in New Hampshire, where people have vacation homes, and some people like to drive jet skis on the water, but they're very noisy. Okay? Well, who owns the right to the quiet associated with that lake? It's not clear. And so because there's not a well-defined property right, it's not easy for people to buy and sell the right to make noise. Now, if there were only a modest number of houses around that lake, you could imagine an arrangement where they would say, let's get together and agree that there will be no jet skis on the lake between 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. or something. Okay? That would be in effect defining the property right, and then people could transact over it. But in many cases, that's very, very hard to do. Okay? So that brings us to carbon and externalities. So under current science, carbon emissions would appear to be a quite significant externality. Okay? The greenhouse gas effect will lead to measurable, noticeable increases in the average temperature. Those will have many effects, many bad, some potentially beneficial, of course. Okay? But it's clearly a case where individual action, burning fossil fuel, okay, by individuals or businesses, affects third parties, and the current science says the magnitude of that effect is quite substantial. Okay? And therefore, absent intervention, the use of fossil fuels might be too high relative to the social optimum, because the people who are doing it, when I drive my car, when a factory burns coal or oil to generate energy to make its product, and all those sorts of things, people are taking into account their own costs and benefits from so doing, but they're not taking account the fact that they're making the greenhouse gas effect larger, and that's going to affect people who live somewhere else, and indeed generations who are not even yet born, who are not around to do something about the fact that this externality is being generated. Okay? And it's plausibly a case where the property rights are hard to define, where the transaction costs are large, because you can imagine needing coordination across sort of the whole planet, or across very large fractions of the planet, to get everybody to agree to buy and sell the right to emit a fossil fuel. And indeed, since a lot of the effects are on generations yet to be born, it's not clear how they could participate in this bargaining, okay, and bribe the polluters, okay, into the emitters of greenhouse gases into doing less of it to reduce the greenhouse gas effect. So it's completely understandable and plausible, based on standard economics and the existing scientific consensus, that people think we should intervene, we should have policy responses, okay, to the use of fossil fuels. So what have those responses been? Okay, this slide is deliberately too small a font. I'm kind of trying to make the point that there are zillions of policies out there. There are energy efficiency standards for motor vehicles, appliances, aircraft, etc. There are fuel economy labeling requirements or mandatory greenhouse gas emissions reporting. There are tax credits for clean energy, allegedly clean energy, tax credits for high efficiency home appliances or renewable home energy. There are various tax benefits for donations toward recycling, loans and grants for certain kinds of renewable energy. There are boards which try to mandate which types of energy are produced, research and development subsidies for nuclear and other kinds of renewables, many proposals to regulate financial assets in a way that would encourage only the buying, selling of assets that are associated with less climate risk because of their activities. And there's much, much more. Okay, so we could go on for days with a list of all the existing policies, at the federal level, at the state level, at the city level, okay, and so on and so forth. Okay? So why is that a problem? I should say, we should have to ask why it's a problem, because it might sound like in principle, this stuff makes sense given what I've said up till now, because it is trying to reduce the use of fossil fuels, and we've accepted that there is a logical case for wanting to engage in some amount of reduction of the use of fossil fuels. Okay? First is that many of those policies target the externalities only indirectly, okay? And so they may generate greater costs than benefits, because they're going to involve affecting a lot of aspects of the particular setting or the economy, some of which are going to be costly and not actually have a major effect on reducing the use of fossil fuels. I'll give you an illustration in a couple of minutes. Okay? In many situations, reactions by individuals and businesses are likely to partially or even more fully offset the benefits of the policies. So that wouldn't necessarily mean the policy is completely misguided, but it might cause you to reevaluate whether you're really getting a lot of bang for your buck, okay, if there's substantial offset in the private responses. And of course, the private responses are a cost, are a use of resources that, other things equal, we would like to avoid. Third thing is that figuring out the correct standards, okay, what should be the fuel economy standard? How much should we try to reduce fossil fuel and so on, okay, is incredibly complicated because most basic level, some effects of greater temperatures are benefits rather than cost. Also because there's a use of fossil fuel in more or less every aspect of a modern economy. Okay? Also because there can be these offsetting effects by individuals and so on. So I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second. And last but not least, enforcement is easily going to be both costly and highly imperfect. So that means you will inadvertently generate sort of unwanted effects of rewarding the people who circumvent the regulations of the kinds that I've already discussed. Okay, and at a minimum, you may need to expend substantial resources monitoring, seeing who's violating the rules or the regulations and trying to penalize them. But that's never particularly easy and involves significant costs. Okay, so let me give you some examples to make that sort of concrete. Weatherization, okay, is attempt to install insulation in a way that would make an apartment or an apartment building or a house more fuel efficient. Okay, so there have been these state-funded efficiency upgrades made available in the US to low-income families. Okay. The problem is that these low-income families typically have very low energy use. And the cost of doing these upgrades tends to be some fixed non-trivial cost. And maybe it takes $1,000 or $2,000, okay, to do this upgrade. But that creates the possibility that since those households were using very little energy, the environmental benefit, the reduction in carbon emissions that you achieve is very modest because these households have low energy use and don't actually add up to the cost that it takes to upgrade their apartments and insulation and so on in a way that implies reductions in emissions to a substantial degree. So there's a research paper published in by the National Bureau of Economic Research by well-known economists that looked at exactly this kind of program in California, and it found that the assistance program had a social rate of return of negative 9.5% per year. Okay, the social rate of return means the rate of return including the benefits, okay, from reduced carbon emissions. So not just the pros and cons for the homeowner or the renter who might have done this insulation, spent the money and therefore had lower heating bills. It's also taking into account whatever negative effects we attribute to, okay, the increased greenhouse gas we would get from not having the weatherization, and found that all things considered, okay, this type of investment actually had a substantially negative social rate of return. Okay, so that's sort of a devastating analysis of this particular policy. Okay? Second example, electric vehicles. Okay? Lots of proposals, lots of policies that try to promote the production of electric vehicles. The US had such a policy, which actually lapsed. The Biden administration is talking about trying to renew it. Okay? Crucial insight, though, is that the environmental benefits of having people switch from gasoline-powered cars to electric cars is that you still have to get the energy to power them from someplace, okay, because you have to charge the batteries. And so the benefit, the effect on reducing emissions is going to depend on what source you use to power the batteries, because the emissions generated by burning coal versus oil versus natural gas, okay, differ quite substantially. Okay? So it turns out that if the electricity comes from coal, this paper showed that switching from fossil fuel engines can increase emissions because the emissions from gasoline that's used to power cars, non-electric cars, okay, is less per distance traveled, okay, than the emissions you get from burning enough coal to charge the battery to be able to travel the same distance. Okay? Indeed, this research found that if you imposed in the US a uniform subsidy, okay, for buying electric vehicles, the value of that subsidy should actually be a $742 tax rather than what the policy that existed, which was a $7,500 subsidy. Now, the paper went on to show that if you could tailor the tax or subsidy by region, US has certain regions which rely heavily on coal to generate electricity, others which rely on natural gas or even on renewables. So there are parts of the country where it would make sense, okay? But of course, then if you try to do that and have a differential tax or subsidy for EVs in some part of the country and not others, you run into the political complaints from the people who don't get the subsidy, but of course then you also incentivize the people located in places where they don't get the subsidy to simply buy their cars, okay, in the places where the subsidy does exist, or have their relatives or their friends buy the cars, and that's going to undo the policy to a significant degree. And there are further potential externalities from the electric approach per se. Battery production and disposal involves lots of heavy metals, lots of mining, and those have their own externalities. And so a complete policy analysis should worry about those, not only the externalities from emissions. Corporate average fuel economy standards, okay, are rules which require the manufacturers of cars to make sure that their vehicle fleets, on average, achieve a certain number of miles per gallon, a certain minimum lower number of miles per gallon, okay, so that we are in principle driving more efficient cars and using less energy, okay? However, if you tell people that they're getting more miles to the gallon, that might encourage some of them to drive more. Or if you tell them that they're being more environmentally efficient because, okay, they're driving a high fuel economy car, okay, they therefore think, well, it's okay to do more driving rather than walking to work or taking the subway or whatever. This is known as a rebound effect, okay? People's private behavior can offset, okay, what you're trying to accomplish because you've changed the relative prices they face for one activity versus another, okay? And in many settings, there's clear evidence of such rebound effects. You might also think that these CAFE standards could prompt owners to keep existing vehicles longer, okay? Existing relatively high, poor fuel efficiency cars, okay? Because they don't want to have to switch to the ones that have higher fuel efficiency because they don't, not as high powered, they don't go as fast and things like that, and thereby again offset some of the emissions reductions. Research that looks at the details finds that these CAFE regulations, which have been around in the United States for quite a while and many other countries, are a far less efficient way than simply having a higher gas tax, okay, which would incentivize everyone to do less driving, okay, and or to switch to cars that got more miles per gallon. Okay, so let me sort of state where we are so far. Taking as given that carbon emissions are an externality, and given the framework I described, policy should, in principle, want to intervene. Okay? Argued that existing approaches, however, are costly. Some, as I discussed a little bit, might even be counterproductive. Okay? Anything with a negative rate of return is certainly counterproductive. Social rate of return is counterproductive. And so, not just from those examples, but from far more extensive work that economists have done, there is deep skepticism that this command and control hodgepodge is the best way to address this particular externality. Okay? So is there a better way? Okay? And that brings us to the carbon tax. An alternative approach is to tax all the activities that generate carbon emissions and more broadly other greenhouse gas emissions. Okay? This approach is known as a Pigovian tax after an economist, a British economist from roughly 100 years ago, I think, named Alfred Pigou. And it also says something very specific about what the tax rate should be. The tax rate should be set equal to the marginal social cost of carbon. What is the marginal social cost of carbon? It's the extra damage that is done to present and future generations, to the economy today or next year or any time in the future, appropriately sort of discounted back to the present, from emitting 1 extra ton of CO2. Okay? So in principle, it's very simple and very clear to think about what this marginal social cost of carbon is. And so if you make the tax on emitting a cost of carbon, a ton of carbon, equal to somebody's estimate, an accurate estimate of what that cost is, what cost that imposes, then people will reduce their use of carbon to exactly the rate that gets you the most efficient economy overall. Okay? So just to be concrete, there much recent research, I'll discuss some more of it in a few minutes, that gets a marginal social cost of carbon of $125 per metric ton of CO2 emitted. Now, is that a lot or a little? Way to sort of think about that is to translate it in what it implies for a gallon of gas. It's about $1 per gallon of gas. Okay? That's significant, okay, but a lot of countries already have gas taxes that are equivalent of $3 to $4 per gallon of gas. Okay, so it's not sort of catastrophic. It wouldn't fundamentally change society. In particular, note that it is very much finite. It says that we should raise the price of emitting carbon by a noticeable amount, but in no way, shape, or form raise it so much that hardly anybody ever wants to use carbon. It doesn't translate into higher gas tax of $100 a gallon or anything like that, and certainly not an infinite price. In contrast to much of the discussion that you will hear from Greta Thunberg and the like, arguing that we basically have to eliminate the use of fossil fuels, these estimates of the marginal social costs of carbon are very much a finite number, okay, and not at all implausibly accommodated without sort of drastically upsetting the economy. Okay, I mean, of course, lots of taxpayers will kick and scream over that, but okay, it is not outside the realm of many countries' experience. So what are the advantages of this approach? Okay? In principle, in theory, it's just incredibly simple. It's one policy. You impose one tax, okay? It's imposed on all carbon-emitting activities, okay? End of story. We don't have the incredible hodgepodge, okay, of all the other policies I've discussed to think about. We don't have to think about doing everything. We just do this one thing. Why? Because first, this policy unambiguously raises the price of emitting carbon, okay? It makes any activity, whether it's driving your car, running a factory, taking an airplane to go on vacation, whatever it is you do, okay, you're going to have to pay more to be able to do that to a degree that reflects the harm that your activity is doing to present and future generations by generating more carbon emissions. And so the carbon tax forces the parties to any transaction to consider implicitly the emissions impact of their production and consumption decisions. I say implicitly because you will not necessarily always see the tax or pay the tax separately. You might just go to the gas pump and see that gas is $5 a gallon instead of $4 a gallon, and you'll pay the $5. If you read the fine print on the pump, you can probably learn how much of that is the tax. But in effect, every good or service that is produced will be that uses energy will be more expensive to the degree that it uses carbon-based fuels. And so those things will be more expensive and people will tend to do less of those things, which is exactly the goal of the carbon tax. Okay? And indeed, for something like research, if there's this tax on using fossil fuels, that means it's more attractive to use solar, wind, et cetera. And so people will be more incentivized to want to do research on those things, okay, in order to substitute away from paying this high price for fossil fuels because that arises because of the tax. Okay, so there are two crucial caveats. Okay? First is budget neutrality. A carbon tax is going to generate some revenue, and so some proponents of carbon taxes want to use that for more spending. Okay? That is absolutely not, okay, what I'm saying. I want to assume that instead that revenue is used to lower existing distortionary taxes. Economists broadly agree that almost any tax, whether it's on your labor income or your savings or whatever, tends to create a distortion in the economy because it makes you change your decisions based on the tax rather than just the profitability or the efficiency of the activity. Okay? So what we're going to do with this carbon tax revenue is keep the overall amount of tax revenue the government's collecting the same by lowering some existing tax rates on other things. Okay? That means we're separating debates over whether to have a carbon tax from debates over the size of the government. What is clear is that many people who advocate for a carbon tax would love for the government to spend a lot more on redistribution or highways or whatever, which may be good or bad, but it should be a separate issue. We should think about that on its merits, not just assume that if we get the revenue, it goes to a bigger government. So we're holding the size of government constant by having budget neutrality. Second huge caveat is that this case assumes that the imposition of the carbon tax includes repeal of all the existing anti-carbon, greenhouse gas policies, all the command and control type of things I had on the earlier slide. Okay? So this tax, adopting this carbon tax in this ideal world would change the structure of carbon policy, but not the overall strength of the carbon policy, not the degree to which we try to penalize the use of carbon. The magnitude of the tax should be determined by the marginal social cost of carbon, as I discussed, excuse me. And that, of course, was true implicitly for all the command and control stuff. It was just incredibly messy to do. Okay, and so that is incredibly important. So when I talk about an ideal carbon tax, I mean those two assumptions in addition to what I said about the level of the tax. And the conclusion then is that under current science and these key assumptions about budget neutrality and repealing existing stuff, okay, the case for this ideal tax is strong. Why? Because it raises the price of a negative externality, the carbon emissions. It lowers taxes on good things and incentivizes those good things more, so we get more savings, more labor supply, we get better policies with respect to that part of the economy, and we eliminate all the costs and confusion, okay, of all the existing command and control type policies. Okay, so this view is sufficiently widely held amongst economists that there's something called the Pigou Club, okay, has a Wikipedia entry and a website and all that, which is a collection of a bunch of very well-known economists broadly across the political spectrum, including many Republican economists as well as many Democratic economists, who all agree that this would be a much better approach than the existing kinds of regulations and mandates and subsidies that we currently have in place. Okay? But, okay, in the real world, I'm going to argue it's not so clear. First, getting the tax rate right is hard. Okay, I suspect it's sort of obvious from the way I described the marginal social cost of carbon calculation that it takes an incredible amount of information about all the carbon emitting activities, ones that are harmful, ones that are beneficial. We don't have good controlled experiments available to examine, to estimate many of those effects. Okay? The calculation has to merge economics and the physics of climate change, and that's not trivial either. And there's indeed plausibly uncertainty about various aspects of the physics. One well-known economist, Robert Pindyck at MIT, has argued kind of long and hard that the uncertainty, okay, over all of the things that go into this are so enormous and so, overwhelming that it's just impossible to think about what is the right marginal social cost of carbon. So at a minimum, getting the tax rate right is going to be extremely hard. Okay? It involves all the assumptions, and there are examples that show reasonable but different choices can produce radically different conclusions. Okay? In particular, any such calculation, since it has to take account the future, has to think about present versus future generations. Okay? If we impose a tax now, it's going to adversely affect the people who are alive now. They're paying more taxes in the hope of making people better off later. How should we balance those things? Should we say future generations are going to be much richer than we are, so we don't care about them that much? Or should we, say, have generational neutrality and put exactly the same weight? There's no good economics answer to that question. Okay, and so that's a huge source of uncertainty about actually doing this in practice. To illustrate that, a recent meta-analysis of 500 studies had estimates of the marginal social cost of carbon ranging from negative $13.36 per ton to $2,386 per ton. So at one extreme, authors of one study said we should actually be subsidizing carbon just a little bit. Okay? And at the other extreme, had a number which is much higher than the number I gave earlier, and which would have implied, therefore, a much higher gas tax and everything else, and so might indeed have a much bigger negative effects on the current economy, and of course would generate much more political opposition. Okay? As a different kind of illustration, one study estimates a range for this marginal social cost of carbon for this ideal tax from $56 to $785 per ton, depending on how it weights current versus future generations. But that degree of uncertainty is sort of overwhelming if you don't know over that broader range how can you possibly propose policy and have confidence that you're actually making things better? Further problems, okay? Different carbon activities that use carbon, okay, generate different amounts of emissions, okay? The amount of emissions you get, okay, from coal versus gasoline versus oil to produce a given number of BTUs is substantially different. So actually, you don't just need exactly one tax. You would have one tax rate for coal, you'd have a different tax rate for gasoline, a different gas rate for oil, and so on and so forth. There are other activities, okay, which also lead to greenhouse gas emissions, so you'd need taxes for those. Okay? That starts to make it sound even more complicated and messy to actually design, okay, an optimal marginal social cost of carbon. Okay? Carbon emissions can also have third-party effects beyond just carbon emissions, just standard pollution, and so you should take that into account. That's sort of going to further complicate the situation. Okay? And a huge potential issue is that if some countries adopt a carbon tax, even if they could get it right considering their own countries in isolation, that's almost certainly going to incentivize many activities to shift to other countries that have lower or no carbon taxes. That's a phenomenon known as leakage, okay, which could potentially cause emissions to go up. Okay, imagine that the US or the OECD adopted very restrictive, a very high carbon tax. Then it's much more expensive to produce stuff in the US. So some manufacturing activities might say, we're going to go produce in China or India. But a far more of the energy produced in China and India is done with coal, which is substantially dirtier from this perspective than natural gas or oil. And so you might end up with a net increase in carbon emissions. Okay? Now, there is, I have to mention, a possible remedy for leakage, which is to tax imports based on their carbon content and subsidize exports based on carbon elsewhere. But if you imagine all of the details you'd have to take into account, that's just sort of an overwhelming task. And evasion and avoidance would, of course, emerge almost immediately. Stuff that was produced in carbon in, say, China that should be subject to a very high import tax would find some way to go through Canada and get itself relabeled as having come from Canada and be exempt from the tax and all that sort of thing. Okay? And the political issues are also likely to be very serious. Okay? One last issue with the carbon tax is that political economy and public choice issues are going to make it challenging. That might mean we get non-budget neutral taxes, okay? So that, okay, could be a serious cost if we're actually expanding the size of government in ways that are not desirable. Or we might get a carbon tax on top of all the existing policies that may be trying to penalize carbon way too much relative to the social optimum. Even if the initial deal, excuse me one second. I'm sorry. Even if the initial deal is revenue neutral and eliminates the existing bad policies, it's very hard to eliminate slippage. So much of that stuff may creep back in over time. And the carbon tax is also difficult because it forces voters to recognize that reduced carbon emissions requires using less energy overall. Okay, there's no free lunch. The whole goal is to reduce the use of energy, especially the energy that comes from fossil fuels, but so much of it comes from fossil fuels that you can't have meaningful carbon reduction without just using less energy in total. But that implies the current generations are certainly going to be worse off because they're experiencing higher prices for energy, okay, even if they or future generations gain in the long term. That means carbon taxes are incredibly unappealing to many voters. Indeed, in the US, the state of Washington on the West Coast has twice rejected carbon taxes. And many governments around the world actually subsidize fossil fuels because people like getting their fossil fuels more cheaply. Convincing them that we should make them much more expensive is sort of a non-starter for many politicians. So that would seem to raise the possibility that even if climate change is imposing significant cost, the least bad response might be doing nothing other than repealing existing carbon subsidies. Okay, there's no reason I can think of why government should be subsidizing fossil fuels, but many governments do that. So getting rid of that, okay, is a no-brainer. And of course, any policy which improves the level or the growth rate of economic output is making the economy more efficient, and there are billions of examples we could discuss, okay, is going to be good because it raises GDP and possibly the growth rate of GDP, and that maximizes the resources available to adapt to climate change, okay, which may be, in fact, okay, the best possible approach. We will be experiencing negatives as the planet warms up, some positives as well. Okay, living in Boston, I frankly would be perfectly happy to have it be a few degrees warmer every winter. Okay, but okay, on net, even if it's strongly negative, if we have more resources, we can better adapt, okay, to whatever change is occurring. So to sum up, I think I'm more or less on time, just about. What I've tried to argue is that given current science, carbon emissions impose a significant externality, and that implies intervention might make sense. But current policies are costly, ineffective, and are likely to be so no matter how we design them, okay? The ideal carbon tax would be far better. Yet, actual carbon taxes have real costs, okay, and are unlikely to be anything close to the ideal. So perhaps doing nothing, okay, is the best that policy can actually do. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just stop sharing my screen so then I can see faces better. There we go.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. You missed the clapping, so happen.
Thank you.
All right. So, any questions? Please come stand in front of the screen so Jeff can see you when you ask a question. And please also just introduce yourself before you ask a question. Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. It was very enlightening. I have a question on your on the basic assumption of the lecture. The question is how climate change can describe it finite when we don't know exactly how it's going to impact us in many measures.
I didn't quite follow the question. How can we know what climate change is going to do?
How climate change can describe as finite, as you described at the beginning of the lecture, finite, okay. When you don't know how it's going to impact us in any measures.
Okay, so is there a theorem that says the impact has to be finite? No, there's no such theorem. I don't mean to suggest that. What I would suggest is that it's hard to think of anything that unambiguously clearly has an infinite cost or seems even likely to have an infinite cost. I mean, say there was a nuclear war, that would have a humongous effect, but it's unlikely it would destroy every single human being or all life on the planet. Okay, it would maybe have profound effects and make incredible changes. Second response is we can only have some sense by having identified the effect of higher temperature on agriculture, the effect of higher temperature on human health from temperature-related diseases. And so that's what this huge literature on the marginal social cost of carbon has done. It's try to use the data that we have to come up with a magnitude, okay? And if those magnitudes were coming out to be $80,000 per ton, and that translated into a gas tax of, $800 per gallon of gas, then I'd say, okay, maybe we don't need to debate whether it's finite or infinite. It's so huge that we should be incredibly worried about it. But none of it comes out that way. It comes out at these much more modest numbers. And that's why I'm saying that it seems extremely likely that the costs are finite. But you're right, I cannot know 100%. No one can know 100%.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you for the question.
Okay, just a reminder, introduce yourself before you ask a question. Okay.
Hi, Professor. My name is Atar. I'm a big fan. Thank you for your lecture. I have two questions. One is short and one is longer. The first one is regarding the carbon tax. Is there any study regarding the elasticity of demand? Because we have in theory that the carbon tax supposedly is going to cause people to consume less. So my question is if we see anything empirically. And my second one is my question to you. I'm curious regarding your opinion as a libertarian about the policy of energy with regard to international security. For example, we know that Biden just announced that he will cut any imports from Russia, which is very small. It's like 7% of your annual consumption. But now you'll move on to Venezuela, which is another rogue regime. 3%, sorry, yeah. Sometimes we need energy for national security purposes, such as what we see with Nord Stream 1. So what is your opinion regarding that? These are my questions. Thank you.
So on the energy for national security purposes, I've always been extremely skeptical on the oil weapon concern, because there's a global market for energy, for oil, and whoever owns it, if they want to get any benefit from it, they have to sell it. And this is not exactly true, but to a first approximation, oil is oil, can be used, okay, broadly. And so the ability of any country to seriously punish others to use that as a weapon seems extremely unlikely to me, and small. So relating that to Biden's decision, I mean, first of all, the amount that we import from Russia is small. But second, I think there will be many ways in which that oil will go somewhere else. It will be relabeled as coming from China or Syria or whatever. And so I think it was very much a symbolic act, not a really substantive act. In addition, apparently many sort of importers had already de facto decided not to import from Russia in the intermediate term. And so again, there's not going to be a big effect on what happens. And the marginal impact of his decision, of his announcement on oil prices, seems to also be very small, consistent with what I've said, that there's a global market. And so any one country's behavior doesn't make much difference.
Hi, thank you for your fascinating lecture and for your paper. I read it and I liked it very much. My name is Hilal Gershuni. I'm also a member of Israeli Forum for Environmental Rationality. So I'm interested in these things. I will play the devil advocate and ask 3 questions in your permission. One is, what do you think about the fat tail, Mark Weitzman's and Nassim Taleb argument that we may have a catastrophical outcome, even if it's small. So maybe doing nothing will not do something for that. And the other thing is, what do you think about R&D investments? Do governments need to do some R&D for I don't know, carbon, all sorts of new technologies. So are the governments need to do that? And the third is, your argument, I can take some of it, and for, I think, almost every environmental issue, I can say, okay, don't tax it, because the politics are messy and also so the same. So maybe it's if you get my question, if we took this seriously, so maybe we would have not done nothing in other issues as well. So that's my 3 questions.
Got it. Great questions. So on the first, on the fat tails, okay, just in case other people aren't familiar, the argument mainly attributed to Marty Weitzman, who was my colleague, unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, is that even if you think the expected value of the temperature increase is something we could fairly easily manage with adaptation, new crop varieties, planting more things in Canada instead of the US, et cetera, there's some risk that this higher temperature increases the likelihood of truly catastrophic floods or hurricanes or whatever, okay? So that's an interesting argument, but my response is, I bet we can think together of 10, 20, 100 other such potentially catastrophic events. And so if we devote lots of resources to dealing with each of those very small probability events, but potentially really awful events if they happen, we've kind of used up all of GDP. And so we have to go mainly with what is likely rather than what is very, very unlikely. Okay, but it's a fair point, and there's not an absolute argument that says we should pay no attention to it. But I think it's oversold, and it would be impossible to actually respond to it, because there's zillions other things that could go wrong. A meteor might come and hit the planet and throw it off its orbit. So should we build some humongous shell outside the Earth that protects it from meteors? Well, the cost of that would be prohibitive, et cetera. On the R&D, of all the things that government might do to address this issue, subsidizing research and development, is probably one of the least bad, because it's ideally, if it's done decently, it's producing new knowledge, and that new knowledge certainly can have some useful, some beneficial effects. The carbon tax incentivizes doing R&D on alternative sources of energy, so it tries to address that point. But then third, libertarians are kind of skeptical of government running R&D because politics creeps in, and we end up giving money for R&D projects to companies that are well connected to the existing administration, who then waste the money and they don't pay back their loans. There's a famous example in the US, a company called Solyndra, which got a $500 million loan and then went bankrupt and all that. So I think that the evidence would suggest that the private sector, which includes universities, of course, does a very good job of producing R&D when there's an interesting question to be addressed. Your third question on taxes is kind of setting me up. Yes, these informational issues of figuring how to design the tax correctly arise for all sorts of other things, for the gas tax, the alcohol tax, the marijuana tax, et cetera, which is why libertarians are pretty skeptical about all of those, and would mainly propose raising taxes by having some broad base, like total consumption or total income, and taxing that at a flat rate, rather than trying to use the tax code for all of these other objectives, because although in principle a lot of those could make sense, in practice they will also be very messy. So I think at least there's a consistent answer from libertarians on that point.
Okay.
Thank you.
One moment, I see Doug has a question. One moment, 1 second. You're muted.
You're muted.
You're muted. Okay.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
So thank you very much. Very enlightening. Thank you. I've heard a lot about the tax, the coal tax, the carbon tax, and I never knew exactly where and why it came about. But I have a question. You showed a fairly large range of cost, and to determine this marginal social cost of carbon, and it's obvious that it's huge. The range right now is huge, and maybe the huge is there because it's the uncertainty. We are not sure. We have too many variables, and so and also at the same time, parallel to the fact that we have a lot of variables, we're not so sure about the actual impact of the climate cost, because now there's changes going on, and that say that maybe it's not as bad as we thought. So I'm just wondering whether maybe an approach rather than doing nothing, which looks kind of funny, even though doing nothing, you said it means removing subsidies and increasing growth, but we're always trying to increase growth and we're doing it the wrong way. So maybe that's not necessarily a solution. But I'm just thinking that maybe there's an approach that we use in markets, for example, when we invest, when we are very uncertain at first, we take a smaller position. And then the next day, as we know a little bit more, we take another larger position. And so maybe we can say, okay, let's start with where most of the observations are range in one, let's say we can say that the $40 is sort of where most of, maybe the median is around $40. And then every year, by law, review the studies. As we have more information and we get more information and we learn more, we can review it and then say, no, this coming year, I think we're going to go to $47 because the idea being, and I don't know if you agree, I'm not sure it's possible, that over time, our information gets better, more specific, the uncertainty disappears to some extent. We'll always have uncertainty, but maybe we'll be able to narrow that uncertainty to something reasonable.
So that's an eminently reasonable suggestion that in fact is exactly the position of William Nordhaus, an economist at Yale, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago for his work on climate change. And he says, there's this uncertainty. We should be trying to de-emphasize the inefficient policies like some of the examples I gave, and introducing a modest carbon tax and gradually increasing it as we see what happens, okay? And that is consistent with his view and my view that this is not an existential threat. This is not something where we have to do a ton of things immediately. We can afford to wait and see how things evolve. Okay. And it's consistent with exactly what you said, emphasizing the accumulation of information, okay, as we go along. So, you know, I can certainly think that that's absolutely a reasonable position, okay, that the magnitudes that he has are not so different than the magnitudes at which carbon taxes already exist in some cases. I mean, take the US example. We currently have, between the state and the federal tax in a typical state, there's probably like 75 cents worth of tax on gasoline. Okay, so adding another $1 is going to make prices pre-Ukraine, but prices go from $3.50 to $4.50. That's just not a major change in the economy. So that would certainly be a sensible, reasonable way to try to figure this out.
The risk, of course, is that that stays as a minimum, and then it keeps increasing. And when the numbers begin to show that you should go down to 25, nobody goes down because the money is already earmarked for some political
Although,
purpose.
you know, voters do like getting taxes lowered, and they seem to be especially sensitive to gasoline taxes and energy taxes. So if there were really evidence accumulating that it didn't need to be 40, it could be 30, one can imagine there would be politicians who would be able to push for
I
that.
guess so. Good. Thank you.
Okay, next question. Okay, go ahead.
I'm Isaac Berthaus. I'm from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. My field of research is financial economics. And my question is quite related to the question you just discussed. The first one is about the discount factor, that your argument is that since we don't know what is the discount factor and the range is so wide, I don't recall the numbers, but let's say, my point is, let's say that for the sake of the discussion, it's you have ranges of a tax, potential tax between 10 and 100. But in any case, why your figure of 0 is more accurate than any figure ranging between 10 and 100? Why it's so accurate that a -1, as you said, you wouldn't suggest it, but you would suggest a 0? I mean, if you still have those estimations, the range seems to be positive, non-zero. So you will go for some tax ranging between 10 and 100. That's the first question. The second one is about the information. How do you think that would change? We are now in the era of the big data, and as we speak, the amount of data that is exponentially increasing about everything that we do may come to help and to figure out what are the activities that are more related to the negative impact of pollution. Those are my questions.
So I completely accept your statement that if we were confident that the rate was between 10 and 100, and we were confident that we would repeal all the existing bad policies, and we were confident that the rate would stay somewhere between 10 and 100, et cetera. If we had a benevolent dictator who could think about all this and had all this information and would stick to it, okay, and we agree with the current science, which I haven't delved into, but I have some reservations about that. But if you accept all those things, then yes, you should at a minimum do 10, not 0. But I think the chances that we actually repeal all the existing command and control stuff is close to 0. Okay, I think the chances that we avoid letting the tax just creep up and up and up, okay, are not great. I think the chances that we keep it budget neutral, okay, are very, very low. So then, given my views that the size of government is already way too big, adding a new tax, which is also going to lead to bigger government, and the government doing a bunch of things which I think are counterproductive, then it's not at all clear what the net effect is, even if you get the marginal social cost of carbon exactly right, because you're taking the extra revenue and doing something which I might disagree with. You know, you might be spending more money to enforce drug prohibition, and I think that's very bad for society. So that's why I come down on 0, because in significant part the political economy, a plus of the uncertainty. On your question about information, yes, we will get tons more information and we have all this big data, but I think that we are over optimistic about the benefits of big data, because in most settings, the question is not just whether we have a lot of observations, it's whether we have an experimental setting. If we had 1 million observations of people getting up in the morning and the sun coming up shortly thereafter, it would still be erroneous to conclude that when people wake up, it causes the sun to come up in the east. Okay, it's not an experiment. Okay, and in a huge number of the cases we'd like to examine, we can't easily tell what was cause and effect, even if we have data for absolutely everything that happens. And so I don't think that's necessarily going to get us. To give you an example, we can certainly take data now and see what crop yields are like in summers that have higher versus lower temperatures over the range that we've observed over the last, whatever, say we had 100 years of data. But even if we had 1 million years worth of data, that's only telling us the effect of temperature fluctuations from one summer to the next on crop yields over the range of observed temperature changes, and taking as given that people have mainly been expecting that range to persist. But now if a new regime occurs and temperature does start consistently going up, there's an upward trend, not just sort of the random fluctuations. Should we assume that our estimate of the effect on crop yields is going to occur year after year after year by whatever amount we estimate? Not necessarily. There will be new crop varieties, there will be new techniques for doing irrigation, there will be new locations, there will be all sorts of adaptation, so that the cost in terms of lost yield of having temperature go up by, say, 1/100 of a degree every year for a century might be very different than the cost if it's 1/100 of a degree higher one summer relative to another. So having lots of data is usually better than not, because you can get more certainty on your estimate, but it doesn't necessarily tell you have the estimate of the thing you really care about. Thank you.
More questions? Okay, go ahead.
Hi, so my name is Riel. I'm a lawyer and very enjoyed the lecture, so thank you. So my question is, I just want you actually to help me to clarify. That's the point. You said that, first of all, we shouldn't pay the carbon tax at all for all reasons and so on. And the second point was that I wish to mention is that you said that even if they do take such tax, just to reduce other parts and not to use it to develop other parts and so on. So I'm trying to figure out, does that mean that you believe that there's like reducing carbon products are not public goods, or it comes from other kind of area? Because if they are public goods, so where the money to fund them gonna come from?
Existing, what is a public good currently? Are you existing carbon policies?
No, I mean carbon reducer products. It can be companies, it can be policies, it can be.
I'm not sure I follow.
For example, no, just for example, you know, any company that tries to reduce amount of carbon by whatever measures and gets supported by government.
So I'm certainly in favor of repealing all of the existing carbon subsidies, if that's what you're asking. If you're talking about private things that private companies are doing to try to seem more, environmentally friendly, claiming that they're reducing their emissions or they're buying offsets, I mean, they should certainly be free to do so. I think most of what they're doing is kind of fake. There's a term known in English as greenwashing.
Yeah.
You pretend to do a bunch of things which allegedly are going to help offset carbon, but actually it's not having any effect on anything. So ideally the public becomes aware of that and makes a distinction between the stuff which is fake and the stuff which is real. But I don't think I've answered your question yet. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure as well, but it's okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me just, maybe to close, just ask you one thing that just constantly bothers me, which is, I don't know the science on this. I mean, I know a little bit, but I just get the feeling that this is way out of proportion. That given the seriousness with which this is taken, and given the incredible lack of clarity and uncertainty on this issue, my feeling is this is way out of proportion. I mean, we're talking about a situation of everybody on the planet worrying about the planet being in danger of something sometime in the far distant future, with estimates that are enormously uncertain. And yet we're having discussions about this like we really know what's going on. If what I'm saying is reasonable, how should this really, if we could really recalibrate this debate, what in your opinion should be done?
Okay, so I'll point you to something very specific. There's an article that's going to appear as the lead issue in a magazine produced by the Cato Institute called Regulation. Okay, Bob, you presumably remember that. And it, I think, addresses exactly your question. It says, let's take the IPCC forecast as given, but let's think carefully about what they mean. What they mean is that what they implicitly show, what they claim to show is that over, say, in the next 100 years, there's going to be large growth in world GDP. And that large growth in world GDP is going to contribute a lot to greenhouse gas emissions. And that's going to contribute to, say, 3 or 4 degrees. And the IPCC estimates that will lead GDP to be, I forget the exact number, but call it 5% lower in 100 years than it would have been if there were no greenhouse gas effect. But that 5% lower is 5% lower than a 400% relative to a 400% increase. So yes, because of all this stuff, we'll be a little poorer in 100 years than we would be absent any greenhouse gas effect, but we'll still be roughly 4 times richer than we are now. And if we don't grow that fast, then we're not going to get nearly as much greenhouse gas emissions, and so the temperature is not going to go up as much, and so it's not a problem. So he exactly argues that we have this blown way out of proportion. And he accepts that there might be a logical case for some modest carbon tax back along the lines of Nordhaus, okay, but I think responds very well to your point. So I would highly recommend that piece to anybody who wants to look at that in more detail.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure.
It was a great talk.
Thank you.
We look forward to having you back. Maybe
I'd
even
love to come.
having you come to Israel and teach in one of our seminars.
I would be delighted. Thank you very much.
Okay, great.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Bye-bye.
Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for everybody for coming. Take care.
Bye-bye.